My topic today is about cooperative corporate cultures. And I will in particular ask the question, why do corporate cultures matter and how to achieve them? Now, to start with, I have to give you a definition of culture. You have seen several definitions, and typically it has been defined as the preferences and beliefs of a group, of a population. And I want to enlarge that definition and focus instead on what has not been mentioned that much, which is social norms. So I define culture as a characteristic of a group that consists of the set of formal and informal social norms that affect the group members' beliefs, perceptions, motives, and behaviors. Now, that requires to define what a social norm is, and by a social norm I mean the group's commonly known standards of behavior that are based on widely shared views how individual group members ought to behave, and that is important. So it is not about how they actually behave, but how they should behave. So there is this should or ought component in a social norm that we should do something, and that is the important part. Now, corporate culture just means a culture thus defined of a whole corporation. Now, the question is, why should we care about something about social norms and culture? And for a very long time, this has been treated as a soft issue because, in particular, economists like to think of them as hard-nosed scientists that focus on incentives and contracts. But as it turns out that good social norms, and by good social norms I mean pro-social or cooperative norms, and it will become clear in a minute what that means, are a key component of economic success. They are important for the success of firms, for the success of geographical regions and countries. And cooperative norms like honesty or promise-keeping are an important facilitator of trust and trade in a world of incomplete contracts. So they facilitate and strengthen contract enforcement. So think just how a market economy works. In a market economy, trade is the most important aspect. If you trade with somebody, you need to rely on another man's or woman's word. You need to rely on their promises, and if these promises are not kept, trade will not take place. So at the very basis of a market economy is the trust in your trading partner. Now, lack of honesty and lack of promise-keeping stifles trade and entrepreneurship and also incentives to innovate. Now, these are claims, okay? These are big claims. Now, let me substantiate them. And my first example here is an example from the Industrial Revolution. There's a very nice book by Joel Mokyr, who has attended previous forums of economic dialogue, and he has written a book about the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And let me give you a quote from his book. He says, entrepreneurial success during the Industrial Revolution was based less on multi-talented geniuses than on successful cooperation between individuals who had good reason to think they could trust one another. In this secure environment, Bolton, the entrepreneur, found his Watt, Clegg his Murdoch, Marshall his Murray, Muspratt his Gamble, and Cook his Wheatstone. So the combination of entrepreneurial talent and technical talent required a lot of trust between these individuals, and he goes on to say that opportunistic behavior was made so taboo that in only a few cases was it necessary to use the formal institution to punish deviants. And so basically the upshot of all this is that the unusual strength of Britain's social capability to punish dishonest behavior in business helped elevate Britain to the leading position in the Industrial Revolution. And one could even formulate this in a more radical way. One may say that actually one of the historically most important events in the history of human evolution, namely the Industrial Revolution and the associated emergence of capitalism, required an appropriate set of cooperative norms that facilitated trust and trade. Now, is this also generally true, or is it only true during the Industrial Revolution? Well, that is the question. And What I will show you now is that there is a large literature that suggests that this is not just true for the Industrial Revolution, but that this is also true more generally. It's a literature that relates trust to GDP per capita. Okay? And I show you now a graph that shows you this relation, and what you see here is generalized trust in strangers in a given society, taking the average of a society. On the vertical axis, you have income per capita, and you see a strong positive correlation here. Okay? Now you might ask yourself, how is it possible that trust has this effect? And so far, it's just a correlation that we see here. Okay? Is there is this a causal relation, or is it just a correlation? Now, the problem is that trust can only have a causal effect if it's supported by trustworthiness. And here I just ask you a rhetorical question. I mean, if you have to decide whether you trade with somebody or whether you trust somebody, and you believe that person will cheat you, you will not trust. So it's as simple as that. If a population has to trust in strangers, it will do that only if the population has reason to trust. And that means the population has to be trustworthy. So that means trust can only be a source of prosperity if it is backed by trustworthiness. But trustworthiness itself is shaped by pro-social norms, like honesty, promise-keeping, or the willingness to cooperate voluntarily. Now, that means that we should have, instead of having a measure of trust, we should have a measure of trustworthiness. Because trust in equilibrium, in a stable situation, can only be maintained when there is trustworthiness. So the question then is, do we have such a measure of trustworthiness? And fortunately, we do. There has been a large research project at the University of Zurich by Professor Maréchal and Professor Kohn and a graduate student, Christian Sünd, and they measured honesty around the world. They measured honesty in roughly 40 countries around the world. I don't go into the details, we can discuss that in the Q&A after my presentation, but they find huge differences across countries in the level of honesty. Now, honesty, if you think a minute, it's exactly an indicator of trustworthiness. If I can rely on you to keep your promises, to be honest, then I have reason to trust you. Now, if you look now at the relationship between honesty and income per capita, what we find is a strong positive relationship between an honesty, the average honesty in the country, and GDP per capita. Now, if my argument is correct, that trust has to be supported by trustworthiness, which in itself is again supported by pro-social norms, then we should also observe that there is a positive relation between honesty and trust, because honesty should generate trust. And when you look at the next graph, you will exactly see that. So we will see that we have trust on the horizontal axis, we have honesty on the vertical axis, and you see a strong positive relation between trust and honesty. So honesty generates trust. Now, this raises the question how we can engineer a set of social norms that constitutes a cooperative, trust-inducing culture or corporate culture. So how can we achieve that? Now I come to the practical aspects. Now, in order to tell you more about this, let us think a minute about the nature of the problem we are facing here. Take again the example of the honesty norm, and think of a society of liars. Think of a society where almost always people don't keep their promises, don't lie to each other, you can't believe them what they say. What kind of society is that? We all agree this would be a horrible society. Now, contrast that with a society in which people keep their words, in which they are honest. This is a society where you can trust others, where you can rely on others' words. Now, it's obvious that in the trusting society, in the honest society, we are all better off. We're all better off. Everybody agrees with that. However, each individual from time to time faces incentives to lie. I mean, we are sometimes, these opportunities emerge, and I can derive a psychological or a material benefit from lying. Okay, and the question is, to what extent do people give in to these temptations? In other words, in economic language, that means honesty. There's an honesty norm, and that constitutes what we call a public good, because everybody benefits from this honesty. At the same time, we face individual incentives to free ride on this honesty norm, okay? So we have a classic public goods problem here when it comes to the formation of cooperative and pro-social norms. We have individual incentives to be dishonest, but collectively, we are all better off if we are honest. Okay, so now having established that we have a public goods problem here, so how do people behave in these situations? And we have a lot of evidence from experimental economics, from behavioral economics, that tell us how people behave in public goods situations. We know how they behave. So let us now see how they behave. So how do people behave individually when they face a public goods problem? And what you see on this graph is the following. You see here in individuals' investments into a public good. So this means, investment here means, to what extent do I contribute to this public good, okay? To what extent I'm honest, let's say. Let's think of probability of being honest here as one measure. And on the other axis, you have people's beliefs about the average honesty of other people, okay? And what you see here is that there's a large percentage of people, we call them the conditionally cooperative people, roughly around 50% in this sample, that is willing to be more honest, more contributing to the public good, if they believe that others are contributing to the public good. But we have also a group of 30% of people who exploit the material benefits they have from free riding. So we have a heterogeneous population. Now you might ask, where are the remaining 20%? Well, there are groups that behave like this, so a kind of hump-shaped, and then there are some quite irregular patterns. That's what you always observe when you study human behavior. There are just things that are difficult to explain. But these two patterns are important. Now, after we have understood that there is a large heterogeneity here and that there is this group of conditionally cooperative people, let me go on to derive some implications from that. Because conditional cooperation has a lot of implications for building cooperative corporate cultures. First of all, it means that by merely affecting the beliefs of the people about how the others behave, you can make individuals more contribute to the public good. You see that on the graph, the more they believe others contribute, the more they contribute. In addition, it implies that leadership is key. Why is leadership key? Because leaders are salient, they are visible, and if leaders are not willing to go the extra mile, then the employees of a company are also not willing to go the extra mile. So leadership is key, selecting cooperative leaders is important. The third point that is important here is you have to avoid the escalation of non-compliance right at the beginning, because it's much more important once you're in a bad state to correct people's beliefs. So don't let you glide into a situation of non-compliance. If you think of corruption in countries, how difficult it is to wipe out corruption, you know what I mean. And fourth, because there is heterogeneity in the population of employees, you have to rely on selective hiring. So it's not only technical skills and competence that matters, it's also character that matters when you hire employees. We know that, but the problem is that it's very hard to hire the right characters for several reasons. First of all, people are very good in hiding their true personality. Second, just hiring the good characters is not an option for large firms, because large firms, they have to sap into the pool of the whole population, and they inevitably have to employ a fraction of people that is less compliant. And finally, it's not just character that matters, it's also competence that matters. So how do you decide when you have to distinguish between an extremely competent person that may sometimes cross the line, and a very compliant person that is not very creative, okay? So there are trade-offs. So what that all boils down to is that we have to face the fact that there is heterogeneity in groups. You will never have completely homogeneous groups. You will have groups of people that consist of more or less cooperative people. And now that raises then the question, how do these heterogeneous groups behave? Now let me look at that. So how do heterogeneous groups behave? Now, when we run these public goods experiments, what we observe is that initially they contribute 50% to the public good. But then what happens is that cooperation breaks down. So cooperation breaks down, and this is a very robust pattern. Heterogeneous groups without supporting institutions are not able to maintain cooperation, despite the fact that they all would be better off. Okay? Now, what is the reason for that? The reason is that initially many subjects have optimistic beliefs about others. Then they notice that there are some people who don't follow the norm, and then they also don't follow the norm. So then they cease cooperating. Now you might ask, okay, what about introducing explicit social norms? Give people the opportunity to say what we should do. And actually we did this in many experiments now. So, and what typically emerges in this situation is that people quickly understand they're all better off in this situation if they cooperate. So they say, we should all cooperate. Okay, we should all cooperate. And then what happens? What you see here. So basically, when I give them the chance to form a social norm, you have the same pattern. It has no impact. But that is quite interesting. So just saying we should doesn't help. So then the question is, what helps? What does really help? And here you might think, well, let's go back to the old economic wisdom. And the old economic wisdom is establish clear goals for every employee and enforce them through centralized monitoring and appropriate financial incentives. Now, the problem with this solution is that centralized monitoring is always imperfect. You never can observe. You don't have a policeman behind every employee. It's just impossible. Okay? Perfect monitoring is impossible. Financial incentives are never fine-grained enough and never perfect enough to cover all behavioral problems. They are imperfect. And finally, the point simply is that if centralized monitoring and financial incentives would really solve the problem, we wouldn't have to talk about culture, because we could solve all through these standard means. But the matter of the fact is that we can't. This is the whole start of the problem. We wouldn't see a positive correlation between trustworthiness or these cultural traits and GDP per capita if we had a perfect world with perfect contracts and perfect financial incentives. So then the question is, what is the alternative? What is left? Selective hiring is good, but is not perfect. Financial incentives, good, but not perfect. Centralized monitoring, good, but not perfect. So let me point out the final alternative. A final alternative is establish strong and clear normative standards of behavior and enforce them through decentralized peer monitoring and peer feedback. And in addition to allowing for peer monitoring and peer feedback, relying on that, you make peer monitoring, peer feedback, and peer sanction part of the social norm. It has to be an obligation to provide feedback. And you have to define the different forms of feedback and when they apply. Now let me show you what happens if we do this in an experiment. So we allow now the groups to provide peer feedback and to mutually sanction each other. Now what you see, the question then is, do groups achieve stable cooperation and peer sanctioning is possible? Well, let me just point out where we were. So these are groups that were not able to maintain cooperation. Almost nobody cooperates here. Now I give them this peer feedback opportunity. Okay? That's the only thing, they're the same people. Now see what happens. Full cooperation is achieved. Full cooperation is achieved. And why is that the case? Well, it is the case because many subjects are willing to incur a cost to provide feedback. Potential free riders are deterred and cooperate too. So and when I introduce here the social norm, You know, I told you when I let people have a social norm, nothing changes. When I do it here, it gets even better. They start from the beginning very high. So basically what I have is, I have a solution that relies on decentralized peer monitoring and peer enforcement, and that is one of the mechanisms through which you can introduce and maintain and enforce a good cooperative corporate culture. So let me summarize, therefore. Pro-social cooperative norms are a key requirement for success of nations, regions, and corporations. But individuals are heterogeneous, and their willingness to cooperate is conditional on others' cooperation, and therefore their beliefs about others' cooperation matters a lot. Leadership and selective hiring are key for cooperative corporate cultures, but they do not suffice. Efficient cooperative cultures rely on voluntary peer monitoring and peer feedback and make them part of the social norm itself. Thank you for your attention, and for those who are interested in reading the details, there is a UBS Center public paper called Behavioral Foundations of Corporate Culture. You can take copies of this with you, and you can also download it from the UBS Center webpage. Thank you for your attention.